Hello, and welcome to Lexicology, the study of words. In order to gain a true understanding of the English lexicon, you'll need some familiarity with the history of English. This history tells us how and why many words entered English through French, Latin, and Greek. You've already seen how historical linguists have traced the history of Indo-European languages using the comparative method. Now we'll focus on the history of English. The language family tree showed us that the English language did not originate in England. It actually came from Germanic tribes that invaded the British Islands after the Romans left. The tree shows the relationship between English and other Northern European languages. Notice how closely related English is to modern German and Dutch. We'll begin our journey with pre-English to give some context to the development of English. These are the roots of the English nation. As I mentioned, the English language did not start out in England. From about the year 0 to 450 in the Common Era, or AD, Celts and their Roman rulers were on the British Isles speaking mainly Celtic and Latin. The Germanic languages that would develop into English were spoken among the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes in northern Germany. These are the tribes that you probably heard of as the Anglo-Saxons. Some common words had already been borrowed into the Germanic languages from Latin before they evolved into English. It's easy to see the influence of trade and religion on the German language in this early stage. Kettle, wine, cheese, bishop, and church were all words that were borrowed from Latin. Around the year 450 CE, their empire was nearing the end and the Romans left Britain. The Romanized Celts were then left to fend for themselves against the tribes from the north. Since they could not rely on Roman defenses anymore, they asked for help from the German tribes in northern Europe. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes were more than happy to help out. In fact, they liked England so much they decided to stay. England was soon settled by the German tribes, who naturally brought their languages with them. We'll mark the year 450 as the beginning of the English language. The era from about 450 to 1100 CE is known as Old English. We have some written documents from this era. The most famous is the epic poem Beowulf. Looking at this document, we hardly recognize it as English. The alphabet looks vaguely familiar, but the words just don't seem like English. Be sure to go to the Beowulf link in the unit folder to hear what this language sounded like. Most of my students say it sounds more like Swedish or German than it does English. I have divided the era of the English language following dates generally agreed upon by historians as turning points in the language. You may find other dates in your reading. I have given dates that I think will be easy to remember. We'll mark the beginning of Old English as 450 and the end at 1100 in the Common Era. 1100 is about the time of the Norman conquest in 1066. In 1066, William the Conqueror invaded England from Normandy, which is part of modern-day France. The conquerors spoke French, so the royal court and the rulers in England all spoke French. Unlike the Germanic invaders who established settlements, these invaders for the most part did not assimilate with the native English population. They had little interest in the English language and can be thought of more as rulers and not settlers. Many words came from French into English at this time. As you can imagine, with French as the official state language, categories having to do with the government or church were influenced heavily by French. Many other French words were brought into English, including cooking, household, and many other ordinary words. However, the sound, the grammar, and the most frequently spoken words of English were not changed significantly. This is why, in spite of a heavy influence of French on the English lexicon, English is still a decidedly Germanic language. The Bayeux Tapestry depicted in this slide is a beautiful documentary of the Norman invasion. I've provided a link in the unit folder to an ingenious animation of this tapestry. For the people of the time, who were for the most part illiterate, this 230-foot-long tapestry was their equivalent to watching a movie about the invasion. It didn't move like the YouTube clip, but it was, and still is, very exciting. The most famous literature from the Middle English period was written by Geoffrey Chaucer. Many of you may have read the Canterbury Tales when you were in high school. This slide gives 18 lines from this epic poem. Many of the words are easily recognized as English words, but others look archaic or positively foreign. Be sure to follow the link in the unit folder to hear a reading of this poem. You can follow along with the translation on the next slide to see how much the English language has changed. Look particularly at lines 9 and 10. See if you can figure them out before looking at the translation on the next slide. So, were you able to make out the translation? And many little birds make melody that sleep through all the night with open eye. This brings us to the early modern English era. Most scholars recognize the beginning point around 1450. This is about the time of the Renaissance in Europe, which created a worldwide interest in science and history. Science was flourishing, and new ideas called for new words to express them. Because of this, many words were introduced from the classical languages, Latin and Greek. When we think of the early modern English literature, we think of William Shakespeare. The language of Shakespeare is much closer to our contemporary language than that of Chaucer, but if you've ever watched a Shakespeare play, you know that it's still a little difficult to follow. One bit of technology that revolutionized humanity was the printing press. Invented in 1440 by Gutenberg, the printing press was brought to England by William Caxton in 1475. Suddenly, books which had been available only to the most wealthy citizens became relatively common and affordable to anyone. People became interested in learning to read, since now there were books to read. Broadening access to information forever changed society. Sound familiar? People likened the printing press to the internet, but it was even more revolutionary. It fundamentally changed human nature. Along with more books came the standardization of English spelling and the compilation of dictionaries. This made it possible to document language in a systematic and influential way. I include this excerpt from a soliloquy by Hamlet to illustrate the difference between early modern English and what we speak today. This is truly a beautiful piece of work. Wouldn't it be awesome to be able to speak like this with your friends? What a piece of work is a man. We consider the late modern era to have begun in 1700, and it continues to the present. We use 1700 as the date because it was around this time that dictionaries were first used to document English. For the first time in history, language was becoming standardized. As an example of English spoken in our modern era, I've included Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. This may not be a speech that would be given today, but we have no problem understanding it and admiring it for its economy and clarity. So, that's our super abridged version of the history of the English language. I encourage you to dig deeper into this history. A lot has been written on this fascinating topic.